My name is Terra Destinger. Not quite a Laurel, going for the record for known world's longest vigil. Um, but in any case, I've been making patterns since I was about 9 years old. I have been making patterns professionally since about 2004. Before that, I was only making them for myself and in classes and things, but I have tons of patterning experience that I want to share with the world because it is a hard thing to learn how to do. There's not a lot of training available in it, especially for anything other than super, super basic modern clothes for the most part. So I always try to share what I have learned with other people to the extent that I'm able. You probably, if you are here, have noticed the link to my Google Drive where the handout for this class is. I will be putting the presentation. I did a PowerPoint earlier today. My life has been a little bit crazy, so it hasn't been done for very long. But I will be putting the PowerPoint that I'm using today into my Google Drive, so it is available for everyone, along with all of the other handouts I've done for all of my other classes. So you are absolutely welcome to pilfer that and steal whatever you want, including teaching classes based on anything that I've done. I don't mind. Information needs to be shared. So with that, I am going to start sharing my screen so y'all can see what I've been working on today. So, okay. So there's our oh dear. Sorry, I'm working on a new desktop display that I'm not used to because of my dog's medical emergency this week. I had to move downstairs, so my screen is not going in the direction it's normally going. It's very distracting. All right, so here we are. Crash course in patterning Cotehardies. I teach almost all of my classes that are pattern related with Cotehardies because they are a perfect example garment. They are deceptively simple looking, but also because anyone can wear a Cotehardie and everyone looks good in a well-fitted Cotehardie. The first thing we're going to need to do is take measurements. I have a very lengthy measurement sheet in the handout. We don't need all the measurements that are in the measurement sheet. I just like to give you the whole list of what I would take if I were making something incredibly elaborate. You're never going to regret having extra measurements. Sometimes it can be really, really helpful having extra measurements for someone who doesn't live with you if you want to make them something that they don't know about. Sometimes it's great to have your own measurements so you don't have to try and find a buddy to measure you later. But I have highlighted the measurements we're going to need for today in this. Pretty much, we're going to need all of the torso circumferences. We're going to need a lot of the shoulder-related measurements, the front length, the back length, side height. I have notes on a couple of these. I can flip back to this if anyone needs it, but I'm going to move right along for now. And we're going to start with a couple of the weird measurement tips I've learned over the years. So if you sew long enough, you will almost always run into a time where that neat trick for finding the natural waist, where you tie a string around the middle of someone and have them bend from side to side and then measure along that waist string, you're going to find someone that doesn't work on. Not all of us are shaped like that. So if you're having a really hard time trying to get the waist on someone who's a little bit more apple-shaped, a trick you can use to get that to work is to have the person you are measuring bend, like relax, keeping your shoulders relaxed, just bend your arm sort of at a 90-degree angle, and then tie the string right around the middle at the level of the bottom of the elbow. And just keep that nice and parallel to the floor. Because if you do that, you have a static reference point you can use. Even if it's not exactly the waist, it will be close to where their waist is. And it's something that is an objective point to reference if you cannot get a string to settle at the natural waist. This is really, really helpful if you have someone that you know you're going to be doing multiple fittings on or multiple measurements from. having something that you can use as a reference is really, really helpful. So this is not a tip you have to use for everyone by any means, but it can be really, really beneficial to know that. Another weird measurement, this one, if I had known this a decade ago, I would have so many things that fit better. So taking your waist measurement, you go around the smallest part of your waist. Taking your hip measurement, you usually go around the biggest part of your hips. But the way almost all of us are shaped, we have a little bit more in front at the waist than we do in front at the hips. So if you are just using this measurement and the thick part of your body at the hips, you have this little area that you're going to be dragging the fabric in toward the space between your legs, and it's not going to hang smoothly down and be flattering. It is going to emphasize this shaping that, at least from a modern aesthetic perspective, we do not like. So the way you can get away from doing this and make sure that your garment stays more balanced and it flows and hangs beautifully is you take that string you've tied around your waist and you just stuff a ruler up in that string. And then when you take your hip measurement, you take it around that ruler. And you'll be adding a couple inches to your hip measurement. But what that's going to do is make sure that you are not dragging your front panel off grain as it's shifting your fabric toward the back because you didn't leave enough room for this gap. So it's going to make a lot more flattering garment if you can do it that way. So another super critical measurement that sometimes people don't take that I find incredibly helpful for things is the side height measurement. So placing the point of your underarm in exactly the right location is super important to how mobile and comfortable your sleeves are. If you make that way too low, then your sleeves are going to hang up when you lift your arm, and it's going to restrict your mobility. If you make that too high, it's going to be digging into your armpit and it's going to be really uncomfortable. So what I tend to find works best is if you have whoever you're measuring, whether it's you or somebody else, stick either 2 fingers right up under their arm and then put their arm down and relax their shoulder and measure from the bottom of those fingers down. Or if you're doing something really fitted, like if you want a bust supportive Cotehardie, you want one that's a little bit more snug, then you only use 1 finger, but it's still stick the finger up right under your armpit as high as it'll go, and then relax your arm again, and then lift your arm up just only enough that you can get the tape measure in there and measure from that finger down. And that's about the amount of gap you want. You do want to have the person who's being measured use their own finger, not just because their armpit's probably going to be a little sweaty and they don't have to be as embarrassed if it's their own hand, but also because your fingers are proportionate to your body and how much room you are going to need in your underarm. One of those cool little body proportion things where that just sort of works out. So I got a couple weird measurements on my measurement sheet that you probably haven't seen elsewhere before. This one you might have seen. Let's just call it the duck measurement. You make a little duck face. You need to measure, if you're planning on having sleeves that are just snug and don't have any buttons or other closures at the cuff, you are going to need to measure not just your wrist, but your hand is a little bit bigger than your wrist. You want to be able to get your sleeves on and off. So measuring around the hand when you're making this little duck shadow puppet is the way that you can do that. It's kind of difficult to get the measure tape to stay up over the knuckles and over the meaty part of the thumb here. If you are struggling with it, I have found that a flat rubber band like they use to hold together produce actually works really well. You can get that positioned, it'll stay in place and it'll help hold, it's kind of grippy, it'll help hold the measure tape in place. So putting that rubber band on there can be really helpful for getting that aligned. An extra note on this, if you want to do a Cotehardie that has those beautiful extended cuffs that go all the way to the knuckles, the little mitten cuffs, I would highly recommend doing it better than I did, because I used this method and just sort of like made my cuffs the inverted part of what the forearm looked like. And when I was marshalling, holding the marshal staff was enough to make my cuffs ride down and act weird. So if you want something that is going to go over the back of your hand like that, like the mitten cuffs that you see on some Cotehardies, I highly recommend that when you take this measurement, you use the rubber band method, but then you like hold a coffee mug when you take the measurement. So you're widening just a little bit more so you can hold things without your mitten cuffs trying to fold back on themselves. Super, super helpful having that measurement be just a little bit bigger. The next weird one, I recruited my housemates to show you this one, so I didn't have to actually steal them during the class and have them be my dummies. I made them help me take a picture. The next one is minimum hem circumference. So I've heard this stated as the number one failing when people are making historic clothing is using too little fabric. But how little is too little? How little fabric can you get away with? What if you only have 3.5 yards and you want to make a Cotehardie? Is it enough? The sort of metric I use to figure out if your skirt is big enough is to take what I call the lunge measurement. And you basically take the widest step you are capable of taking, and you measure from the front of your forward toe to the back of your rear heel, and you double it. And your hem circumference should be no smaller than twice this measurement. Because if that's the case, if you, for whatever reason, need to just pick up and book it across sight, you're not going to trip over your skirt because it's too narrow if it's at least that long. Same thing goes if you are making a shorter Cotehardie. If you want to make one of the knee-length Cotehardies, for example, you would still do the same thing. You still take that super deep lunge. You just measure from the front of your forward knee to the back of your rear knee. You just want to make sure that the widest step you are capable of taking is going to be accommodated by however big your hem is. Obviously, you can go bigger. There is no harm in having a bigger skirt, but you don't want to go less than that. The third and weirdest measurement is this one. If you want a Cotehardie or other garment that is made in a non-stretch fabric and you want to be able to pull it over your head, you need to make sure it fits around your shoulders, which when I say it makes sense, but I can't tell you the number of times that I or someone I know has made something and forgotten that and went to try and pull it over their head and then realized that they had to put a closure in even though they didn't want to do one. So this measurement is not necessarily consistent on everyone. This is where it is on the person that we are measuring for this example. Gosh, I can't get my mouse out of the screen. Anyway, some people, the measurement is higher up, like closer around the bicep. On some people, it's a little bit lower down across the shoulder blade. It really depends on the build and the flexibility of the person being measured. This is a quite variable measurement. So if you're not sure where to take it, and it's a really awkward one, so I would be surprised if you were sure exactly where it needs to go, I would start measuring about where he is. It's usually not much higher than where it's being measured in the picture. I would measure that sort of bicep to nose across the back of the neck, and then move the tape down a couple inches and measure down a little bit lower, and move it down a couple inches, measure a bit lower. Take the largest measurement you get around that portion of the body, and that is going to be your minimum torso circumference if you want to pull the thing over your head. So those are the 3 super weird measurements that I'm going to ask you to take for this. You don't have to use them if you are putting closures in your, if you're putting closures on your Cotehardie and or having short sleeves, you're not going to need this. It's better to take the measurements and not need them than not have them if you do decide you need them. So with that, we're getting into the math portion. I'm sorry, there's math. I didn't warn you, I'm evil. We're gonna take those measurements that we need. Hopefully you all have a measure tape and a measure buddy. And then we're gonna apply all of those measurements to this chart. If you printed out the handout, I attempted to format it in such a way that this little guide you're seeing on my screen here is on the sheet right after the blank page that says draw your sketch here, so you can trace it and not have to freehand the thumbnail drawings. You can freehand them if you want, especially if you are not very curvy shaped and you want to make yours a little bit more U-shaped. That is totally fine. But the next step in here after taking the measurements is going to be taking these measurements, doing some math to them, which I've tried to put in here as clearly as possible. You know, this one's half of your shoulder point to point, and it has the number of what measurement that is on the measurement sheet. So I have all of those written out, but for the time being, we're going to go back to that measurement page, which I should have put a second one in the presentation at this stage so we could go back and look at it. Feel free to follow along at this point as you are taking measurements. I am just going to chatter at you about what all of these measurements that are highlighted in yellow look like to me, because sometimes some of them people take a little bit differently. The handout or Crash Course in Patterning uses a Cotehardie as the garment you are making in the instructions, but it is intended to be a class that uses a Cotehardie as an example for patterning in general. So there's a lot of information in there that talks about things like if you want poofy sleeves or if you're making pants, and there's a bunch of stuff in there that you're not going to need. So there's going to be stuff in there that we're not going to go over in this class, since we are specifically talking about Cotehardies today to make things a lot shorter. Don't be alarmed and confused if you are looking at that later and you're like, wait a second, we didn't even talk about this section. And that's because this is a slightly different class that's was intended to have its own brand new handout, and I just did not have time. Chest measurement. That one's pretty easy. Pretty much everyone takes that the same way. You want to take that at the widest point of your chest. Remember to breathe. If you are planning on wearing this for fighting, or you are intending to make a looser garment, it's okay to like inhale and make your chest a little bit bigger. You want to have breathing room. It's important. Ribs or underbust, if you would rather, you measure basically where your ribs are, right below the pectoral muscles or breasts. That one isn't as critical, but it's specifically well placed. It's just sometimes it's more important if you are well endowed up top and you need to know what to transition to before you get to the waist. The waist, I prefer to do this with a waist string to marking on the body where things go, because there's several other measurements we're going to take later on that reference the waist. So if you are measuring someone who does not know where their natural waist is, the easiest way to do this, so you don't have to have that argument about, I know that's where your pants go, but that's not where your waist is. Most costumers have had this debate with someone. You can tie a string around the middle of a person and have them just bend from side to side at the waist, and the string will, on most people, naturally settle about halfway between the ribs and the hips. Again, if you are more apple-shaped, sometimes you need to do the alternative method where you bend your arm at a 90-degree angle at the elbow and measure and put that string right below that and measure there. The easiest way to measure the high hip is if you're dealing with someone who's a little bit skinnier. Sometimes it's pretty obvious where the high hip is. You just measure around where the top of the hip bone sticks out. On someone who's got a little more padding, Honestly, it's usually easier to just measure the waistband of whatever they're wearing. Full hip, you want to get the widest, fullest part of the hips. The difference between your high hip and your waist, so we do need to measure the height from your full hip to your waist. It does not have to be perfectly accurate, just in the ballpark to get us close. We don't need to worry about thigh, knee, calf, ankle, outseam, inseam, waist to knee, or half girth because we are not making pants. You do, however, need the shoulder width, and that is the shoulder width from your neck to the point of your shoulder. That one's pretty simple. We also need the high point shoulder to waist. So that is this corner right where your neck turns into your shoulder. That's right, and I'm trying to not have the weird background disappear my hand, but it's this corner. It's where your necklace settles, right in that corner. And you just want to measure from there straight down to the waist seam, or to the waist string, sorry. The next one, center front length. You want to measure from this hollow right at the base of the throat down to that waist string. The center back length, you want to, if you bend your neck forward, the vertebra that sticks out at the back of your neck, you measure from there down to the waist string. That is your center back length. Your shoulder point to point, this is the most contentious measurement, believe it or not. This is the one that the most people measure entirely differently. For me, I like to have a nice objective point when I'm measuring something. So I poke the shoulder of whoever I'm measuring and find just where that bone on their shoulder is sticking out and measure from that pointy bone on one side to that pointy bone on the other side across the back. And that is the measurement I use because it is not subjective, like, well, you measure in a little bit, or I don't know. Everyone takes this one a little bit differently. That is the standard that we have used at work for years. That is the standard that I'm used to. So that's what I use there. Back width is one of those. I skipped front width. Front width and back width are basically the same, but one's on the front, one's on the back. With that one, and I'm wearing a black shirt, so you can't see it very effectively, but if you are sitting with your arms completely relaxed, especially if you're wearing a snug shirt, the point where your shoulder seam dives into your armpit, the part where you can no longer see that seam and it starts being a fold that goes into your arm, that is where you want to measure your front width. It's right at that point. It's a bit above your armpit, about halfway, and you can see it pretty easily when someone has their arms relaxed when they're wearing a snug garment. And you just measure from that point on one side to that point on the other side. So it's usually just right above where the bust starts getting full. You do the same in the back, and it's that same point where just your shoulder seam disappears into your armpit. So that's the front width and the back width. We talked a little bit about side height and how to stick your finger up in there to make sure that you were the right distance down from the armpit to make a comfortable garment. Oh, there's the waist to full hip. It's just in a weird order. So waist to full hip. I don't know why that's 24 instead of 6, but it is. Past me made bad decisions. We are going to need bicep circumference, elbow circumference, and forearm circumference, as well as wrist and hand. You can kind of just not do the wrist circumference if you're not going to have buttons at your cuff. You don't really need it. But if you are planning on making a button cuffed garment, you will probably want to have that wrist circumference. There's also a bunch of different ways to take arm length measurements. Generally, it's simplified into doing a center back sleeve length measurement where you measure from that back vertebra at the back of the neck down to the point of the shoulder with the arm slightly bent, and then go to the elbow and then down to the wrist. That's great. It's efficient if you are trained at taking measurements. If you're not, that one is a really stressful measurement to take because there's so many different ways you could take it slightly wrong and have it end up being different. So instead of doing it that way, I like to split things up into segments that are a lot easier to manage and less likely to slip as you're taking the measurements. So I use a shoulder to elbow measurement. So you just measure from this pointy bone that we'd used for the shoulder earlier to the point of your elbow. And then for the next one, you measure from the point of your elbow to this knobby little bone on your wrist here. Super easy. Means you have to add them together later when you're figuring out how long to make your sleeve, but it means that you know that you can bend your arm in the sleeve when you're done without it going up to here. All right, so then sleeve opening, we went over that. Make a little duck shadow puppet and measure there. And then we also have the lunge hem circumference measurement, which we talked about, and the over the shoulder diving measurement. Actually, I could talk to you about something else that's not a thing that you have to do. Just there's two different sleeve diagrams. I mostly have been using the normal sleeve because it's a little bit easier to wrap your head around while you are drafting it. I tend to make my Cotehardies with this style sleeve. My very first piece of SCA garb was based off one of the Greenland finds. And it was this really bizarre garment that had a seam that started at the shoulder and went all the way down the arm like this with a triangular gusset in the back. And I was really dubious about it when I made the thing. And it's super comfortable. Like just where it puts the bias stretch is amazing. Like it works really, really well. And if you make your sleeve with that shoulder seam, it ends up wrapping down around your arm in such a way that it puts the seam right down the back of your arm where you'd want to put buttons anyway. So I really like that style, but it's a little bit harder to wrap your head around how to draft it. But you can turn either of these sleeves into the other. So if you want to do buttoned cuffs, you can totally draft this sleeve and then cut a section of it off and use it as a gusset instead of doing it this way. That's why there's two different sleeves in there. You can use whichever one you want, but I will warn you that most of the way I'm talking about sleeves is using the more normal sleeve because most people tend to prefer that one from any time I've asked. They're like, this one just, it looks like a sleeve I'm used to. I am more comfortable with that for right now. You can also draft it this way and then draw where you want your center back line to be. So when you split that up, you can do that after fitting. We are gonna start talking about applying measurements to the pattern. So I'm sorry there's math in here, guys. Eventually, I'm gonna have a version of this class that entirely uses historic pattern drafting techniques where you don't actually do any math, you just make custom measure tapes that divide your measurements into sections, which is super cool. I've been learning how to do that, but I know how to do it well enough that I can use it. I don't quite know it well enough to teach it to others yet. Unfortunately, we do need to do some math on here. I tried to make it as simple as I possibly could. I know there's nothing wrong with math, but it is one of those things that tends to be more time consuming and people get a little bit nervous because they don't want to mess it up. There is no shame in having tools sitting with you. I am a professional pattern maker. This is my work calculator. It sits on my desk because sometimes your day has just been too long to add fractions. There is no shame in that. And this is coming from someone who can count by 8s in decimal points. I do a lot of math, and some days I just can't. So all of these are divided up in a way that should be fairly logical. So because we're doing this pattern piece represents the front and this one's the back. Obviously, you're only doing half of your front width because this is the center front and this is the side. So that one's pretty self-explanatory. This one, you're doing a quarter of your chest measurement because you have a left front and a right front and a left back and a right back. There's an asterisk on the chest measurement because your chest measurement and your hip measurement, the ones that have the asterisks here, are the ones that fairly curvy people may need to do a little bit more. You may need to do a little bit more chest measurement on the front and a little bit less chest measurement on the back, and kind of the inverse for the hips. You may want to do a little bit less in the front and a little bit more in the back. Honestly, I tend to be super lazy about this. And if it comes out, say that your bust is, say your bust is 42, 42 divided by, divided into quarters would give you 10 and a half. But instead of 10 and a half, you could just do 11 for the front and 10 in the back. You can just push the fraction to the side that you want to be bigger and use that as the shift that you're doing. There's no harm in that at all. I tend to use whatever remainder doesn't math nicely enough to make me happy as the thing I shift to the other seam. You're gonna end up modifying it in fitting anyway. We are just trying to get a guideline here, something that's close enough that we can fit it. So most of these are pretty self-explanatory. Most of them are divided into a quarter or divided into half like the neck width, or they're just the entire measurement like your center back length. Again, this does not have to be a proportionate drawing. What matters is that you still have, you know, a neck curve and a slanty shoulder seam and a curve for your arm's eye, and it just needs to be roughly the same shape. The proportion does not matter at all. You just need to know where on the pattern these measurements are going. This part's kind of time consuming. It's gonna take a little bit to get done, but it's really, it looks like a lot, but honestly, your quarter ribs, you're writing this here and here, it's not that big a deal. If I'm gonna try and keep this moving along fairly quickly. So if you are worried that you are gonna fall behind, prioritize doing the back, because the back is the one that we are going to be using first. We're gonna start with that. Anybody who's actually drafting along with this class, now, as soon as you are done working on your little diagram sketch here, the next thing we're going to need is our pattern paper. Exciting. We're actually getting to the point where we're doing that now. In general, if I am drafting a pattern for myself, I'm going to give you this disclaimer. I don't even do my sleeves until I'm on my second draft of the pattern. For this class, I tend to have people do the sleeves earlier on just so we get a chance to talk about them, because we don't have time within the class to do 2 rounds of mock-ups. For my personal preferences, I perfect the body before I make sleeves because I am a fit snob when it comes to my own clothes. And it's a lot easier to get the sleeve to be right if your arm's eye is right. So if you don't get to the sleeves until the second draft, that's totally fine. I did post this on the Facebook page, but for anyone who may have missed it, these are recommended supplies for pattern drafting. You're going to need paper, obviously. The wider the paper is, the better. It's going to just make it easy so you don't have to worry about trying to splice things together. I tend to use wrapping paper because that's what's cheap. I use a sturdy wrapping paper often. You can use packing paper, brown paper like they have for shipping. I've also had someone taking this class who was having some life going on, joined last minute, did not have a chance to prepare, and was like, I don't have any pattern paper, I can't follow along. And I'm just like thinking off the top of my head, I'm like, paper grocery bags. Open up a couple of those. Each bag is big enough to make a pattern piece on. So in a pinch, you can use paper grocery bags. They will work fine. You're going to need measuring tools. Obviously, you need a measuring tape. I really like the clear grid rulers. They help me with a lot of things. A yardstick is often useful to have. I also don't put seam allowances on my patterns. Patterns are a lot easier to modify if you don't have seam allowances attached to them, but some people cannot deal with that. They want to have their seam allowances on the patterns. For the actual mock-up, you are going to want to be able to do this in fabric. I use old bed sheets. I'm a big fan of recycling whenever I can. So anytime I have been at yard sales and saw, stained sheets in the free box, I snag them, wash them, and just use those for mock-ups. You can really use anything that doesn't stretch. I don't put seam allowances on my patterns. I don't use a hem gauge. Some people love doing seam allowances on their patterns. If you want to, that's up to you. The writing tools, yes, pen, pencil, pen, Sharpie, highlighter, seems like a lot, but I'm a very impatient person. I'm stubborn rather than patient. You can accomplish anything through either method. You don't have to be patient to be a pattern maker. You just have to be stubborn enough not to let the fabric win. So I tend to not want to erase things because I'm impatient. So I will start drafting my pattern in pencil. And if I get to a point where I don't know which pencil line I mean anymore because I've drawn several of them as I've changed my mind and reshaped things, I will just put the pencil down and grab a pen and I will draw the line that I mean in pen. And if it gets to the point where like, oh, that pen line needs to change, I'll do it in a marker. And eventually I will work my way from like mechanical pencil all the way up to like fat Sharpie as I change my mind about lines. If I get past Sharpie, I generally just like, today is not the day to pattern and I start over on a different day with a fresh brain. But I recommend you have multiple increasingly intense colors so you don't have to worry about erasing things when you're drafting because it's a waste of time. Cutting tools, totally useful. Paper, scissors, or and a hole puncher and or a notcher can be helpful. You're not going to need them as much on this. Match marks are really useful to have on patterns. I have an actual notcher. They are stupidly expensive for being a hole puncher that only cuts a V instead of actually punches a hole. But you can just do it with scissors. It's not a big deal. Having tape is good because sometimes your pattern will just be a little bit too narrow and rather than tracing out a whole new one, you can just tape on a corner. It's fine. The next thing is something that I got super spoiled while I was in college. They had giant cutting tables that are cork topped. So you could just, when your fabric is uncooperative, you could just stick it to the table with push pins. Super handy, especially for someone like me who hates ironing. But you can also do a similar thing. You can just take an old cardboard box and lay it out on your cutting table and use that to pin things into it. It can be really, really useful. Yeah, friction pens are cool, but they also come back when you freeze them. If they reach freezing temperatures, they will come back. We did test with them at work because we were using them for a while and we ended up having to ban them at work because we cannot have pink lines showing up on the military garments that we make. But yeah, I'm a huge fan of being able to pin your fabric down. It also makes it so you can use a tracing wheel to transfer pattern lines. Super handy. The Ponce wheel is really cool as long as you don't run over your finger with it. That sucks a lot. And then obviously you are going to need things like measurement sheets, which we talked about, any reference images if you're doing something that isn't just the Cotehardie that's in the handout, and your little sketch, all these things that we talked about. Here's the point where my Illustrator was not working, and these are the new illustrations. So you get to see my really bad fine point Sharpie drawings. So when we are patterning the back, we need the paper to be at least as wide as the widest body measurement. And obviously we had our chest, waist, and hip all quartered, so it only needs to be that quarter measurement here. And then we need the top part of this from this line up. This is the high point shoulder to waist. And then this is the waist to full hip. You don't need to cut this out. This is just a bare minimum how big your paper needs to be. And I like to put a straight line down the middle of it for working on centering things. I find that to be really helpful. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to start marking out other things. So we're going to put the high hip roughly halfway between the waist and the full hip. We're going to mark out on one side the side height. So from that waistline up to the side height. And on the other side, we're going to do the waist to center back length up here. I'm going to try and not talk at you too fast because if you're following along, I know that's going to take you longer to do than it takes me to say. So I'm trying to be fair and reasonable here. Honestly, the first couple steps of this is drawing a whole lot of lines in a rectangle. I still do this when I'm drafting things. Sometimes I will usually draw the lines fairly faintly, usually in really light pencil and not really like the whole way across the paper. I don't usually do the whole rectangle because I can kind of eyeball if paper is big enough and oriented correctly for my pattern piece, but I still pretty much always start with this center line and do these horizontal lines to map things out. We had full hip, high hip, waist. The next thing is we want our chest line to be about an inch below where the side height goes. And then we want the ribs to be halfway between the chest and the waist. And we want that back width to be about halfway between this high point shoulder and this chest. Pretty simple so far, just straight lines in a rectangle. The next thing we're doing, and this is where your sketch comes in, is we need to start putting marks where some of your measurements go. The ones that are a little bit more complicated, this neck width, we're starting from the center back line and measuring out to the neck width. And then we're measuring from this neck width to the shoulder width. And then we're going to measure the shoulder width to the center back and see if that comes out the same as your shoulder point to point, because it should be close. If it's not close, I would bump it out to the wider of the measurements because you really do not want to short yourself in being able to move like this. You wouldn't be able to hug people. Shoulders definitely need to be this wide. Next thing is we have that back width measurement we took. That one also should measure out pretty much from the center back line over to here. And then assuming your chest is not the widest of your measurements, you also want to measure that one out. That one can be a little bit, it doesn't have to start exactly here, depending on how far off it is from your widest measurement. On this one, I made it easy and just went from the center back over. If your chest measurement is significantly smaller, you might end up bringing it in a little bit here and a little bit here as well. This is one of those things you kind of have to adjust in fitting. When you get to the point where you're at the rib measurement, that one should be pretty close to center, maybe a little closer to back, but pretty close to center. Your waist should be pretty centered. Your high hip should be pretty centered, and your full hip, at least from when I'm drafting patterns for myself, the full hip is the measurement that sets the width for me. Basically, you're just putting all these little lines in here where those measurements go. You can write the measurements in if you want to, if that makes it easier. Sometimes I will do that. I will just write in what each of these measurements is, and then I will go through and measure and put the marks. That's totally valid. If you're going to show this this pattern to anybody else in general, I trace off a fresh, clean one after I fit it anyway, so it doesn't matter how messy your first draft is. Mine are usually terribly unpresentable. Totally valid. Now we get to connect the dots. So you can see this is kind of sort of a shape that you can see in the handout and in the previous slide. It's a little bit rough. It's a little wonky. You want to make sure that whenever you are doing curved lines that you're making them fairly smooth. You don't just want a sharp corner where it dips in at the waist. You don't just want a line that goes from here to here, because you need to have a little bit of curve in there. A lot of people I know love to use those curved rulers as drawing their curved lines. I find they slow me down. I would rather just freehand it, but I don't judge anyone who wants to use the curved rulers. I just never quite got the hang of them. If you're unsure of the pattern shape you want to try and draw, like if you're trying to figure out this arm's eye, it's absolutely valid to look at your thumbnail sketch or your reference images, your cutting layout, One thing that I used to do a lot when I was new in patterning is I would open up modern commercial patterns, and I would open them up to the page where it shows what all the pattern pieces that are included are, and look at the shapes of them and copy the shapes of them and apply the measurements I wanted to it. Just you want something that kind of gives you the gist of what it should be shaped like. And again, start in pencil. If you want to correct it, you can move on to pen. If you want to correct that, you can move to marker. And then your final line should be Sharpie, because there's not really anything that's more committed than a permanent black marker. So that's more or less how I have this done. However, I got some notes here on things that no one taught me until I should definitely have known better. So anytime you're dealing with a seam intersection, anytime you're dealing with something where it's supposed to sew together, you really want at least a half an inch of that seam to line up to a 180-degree angle. So if you have a rectangle and you sew them together, you get a nice smooth line. If you have this angle and you sew them together, you get a nice smooth line. If you have these angles and you sew them together, you get a point. If you have these angles and sew them together, you get this valley. You really want to only do things like this if you are doing them very intentionally. And there's not really a place in a Cotehardie for that. There are times and places where these things are going to be helpful, where you're going to need stuff like this, but you never want to do this accidentally. You always want at least half an inch where each seam goes together to be this nice, flat, smooth line, because it's just going to make you a better garment. The other thing we need to think about is it's really easy sometimes to throw your entire garment sort of off balance. And this, so I told you that I like to put the center line up the middle of my pattern pieces. It helps me visualize things. And sort of the way I think about rebalancing a pattern is if I end up with a pattern piece shaped like this, which happens a lot more often, honestly, if you are draping than it does if you're drafting, because in drafting, you can put this nice straight line to hold everything together. But if you're draping something, you can easily end up with a pattern that leans this much. And I like to think of it as being like a stack of books that you're straightening, because whatever you take away from here, you have to add to here. So you are not changing the width of this. You are just shifting this width back a little bit until you have a straighter stack of books than you have over here. Hopefully that makes sense. It's a very weird concept to try and explain. I like to think of it with this in mind, because you really have these set measurements you want to keep. You want to keep this full hip measurement and this high hip measurement and this waist measurement. You want to keep all of those intact while shifting the pattern over a little bit. And this, yes, this is annoying to do. It is really tedious and obnoxious to have to shift the balance of your pattern over, but it really does make you not just a better fitting, better hanging garment, but it also makes it a lot more fabric efficient, because you can sit this nicely up along the selvage, whereas this is almost putting itself on the bias, and that's going to use up a lot more fabric and be a lot harder to sew. Once we have that back more or less laid out, the next thing is figuring out the front. And since we are just getting ourselves a starting point that we can fit, our front can be fairly similar to the back, except in a couple of areas. The center back length, obviously, we're going to be using the center front length instead. Instead of the back width, we're going to be using the front width. And then the chest and the hips, we may be adjusting, especially if we're curvy. So once everything has gone through fitting and correction, we may end up with something very different than what we are drafting right now. But for right now, the ribs, the waist, the neck width, the shoulder width, the side height, all of that can stay pretty much the same. We will modify it when we get to fit. There are a number of differences between front and back pattern pieces. The first and most important, and the reason that I hate T-tunics, is that the front of your neck and the back of your neck do not need the same shape. Your back neck is a lot higher than the front of your neck. In general, the back of your neck is going to be somewhere between 1 inch to 1.5 inches deep. And the front of your neck is going to be somewhere between 4 and 6 inches, depending on the individual. The next thing that is going to be different is your shoulder seam is going to be a different angle. In order to go up over the back of your shoulder blade, you end up making the back a little bit taller at the outside of the shoulder, whereas the front shoulder seam slopes a little bit more. Another difference between these two is you can make this back shoulder seam line about 1/2 inch longer than you can in the front and just ease that in, and that gives you just a little bit of extra reach forward. You definitely want to ease that in. You don't want to make a pleat or a tuck or gather or anything. You want to kind of rely on the fact that you can stretch this more biasy line to ease that straighter line in. The next difference is your front armscye, because your arm reaches forward, needs to be carved in a little bit more than the back. You want to do at least 1/4 inch at this apex of the curve, at least 1/4 inch more carved, but it really depends on your build how much more carved it is. The next thing we want to do, and by the way, you can basically trace your back pattern piece off and start making these modifications to the tracing to make your front from the back. The next difference that we're dealing with here is your front is in general going to be above the waist. And unfortunately, this is stolen from another handout that I was able to use Illustrator for. Above the waist, your front is going to end up being a little bit wider than your back, which is perfectly okay. If you look at a side profile of a human torso, we are just a little bit wider in the front than we are in the back. Are there 2 seams along the top of the shoulder? No, there's only 1 shoulder seam. So the pink lines here are what the front pattern piece looks like overlaid on top of the back. So the black line is the back pattern piece we've just drafted, and the pink is what you need to do to make that look like the front.
That makes more sense, because you kept saying back shoulder seam and front shoulder seam, and I'm like, how many seams? You meant shoulder strap, I think.
The back of the shoulder seam and the front of the shoulder seam.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Sorry. Okay, and does this apply to both men and women? The wider front than yes. Men and women both will have a wider front than back. Just shaping wise, that's kind of the way all of us are built. The degree to which it is wider in front than back really depends on the build of the individual. The more muscular you are, the more your front tends to be wider. If you are more streamlined or fluffier, it tends to be a less severe difference. In general, I kind of start with a baseline of maybe 1/2 inch-ish bigger, and adjust as needed. That's one of those things we can adjust in fitting. We will end up just drawing a new line that looks like it's placed better and modifying our pattern in the second round. Unfortunately, this difference from front to back does not also show what the waist or what below the waist looks like, but these lines sort of end up crossing where the back will get a little bit wider and the front will get a little bit narrower. Again, that's very dependent upon body type for the individual. As far as difference between curvier garments and more streamlined garments. There's a couple of things that really, especially if you're doing a bust supportive cotehardie, are different from your typical men's cotehardie. And one of those things, the most prominent thing really, is this curved arm's eye. So anyone who is well endowed, I'm sure, has worn a t-shirt where there were just folds right here, or worn a tank top where there was just this hanging drapey bit that's showing off the side of your bra and it sucks. And that's because that is patterned in the style of a man's garment where it is kind of straight up and down, more of a J shape for that arm's eye in the front. If you are a well-endowed individual, you really need more of a C-shaped arm's eye, because what you need is a little bit more space in the front of the garment, right in the center, and a little bit less height on the side of your front. So you'll end up with a shape that looks a lot more like this. Some of the other stuff is a little bit easier, with the, obviously you could take in the waist a little bit, let out the hip a little bit, and add a little bit of a bump here at the bust. But really the big fit difference is going to come in here. So if that's kind of breaking your brain, here's sort of how you would do that if you were starting with a more traditionally shaped garment. You have this fairly straight, streamlined garment here. You need to add some bust shaping in it. So you kind of draw a line from roughly where the center of the bust would go to sort of mid arm's eye, and you cut it. And then you take a little bit out here and you add a little bit in here, and then you just smooth those lines down and you're there. That's really what it takes. But you notice how it makes this upper chest just a little bit more narrow, and it changes the angle of this arm's eye curve. So that's one of the biggest differences between curvy garments and streamlined garments, is that shaping there. Again, while you are working on your front to back, line up your front and back and make sure that your neck and your shoulder point and your underarm and your hem all have this nice smooth transition between them. While you're doing that, one of the things that was the biggest epiphany for me from being self-taught to actually learning how to pattern stuff is this next one, where your arm has to fit inside the armhole curve you drew. Which sounds really dumb, but I can't tell you the number of garments I made that just felt really pinchy here because I drew a curve, but I didn't know how big to make that curve to make that curve. But if you line up your side seam to your side seam, you'll make this little bucket here, and your arm should fit comfortably into that bucket. And if it doesn't, you need to make these curves wider. And it's really just the bottom you need to worry about. The top of it obviously angles in a little bit, can be a little bit weirdly shaped, but the bottom of that bucket, you need to have your arm be able to fit in there. The next thing we're going to do is sleeve. Apollo, you're fine. So we're going to start the sleeve basically the same way as we did the torso, starting with a rectangle. And that rectangle needs to start with the width roughly of your arm's eye. So whatever, I tend to wait until I've gotten this all nice and squared away and everything makes nice intersections together. And then I will just measure whatever this arm's eye measurement is and use that to start this. So you want a piece of paper at least as wide as your arm's eye. And then you want your sleeve length, and that again is your elbow to wrist and your elbow to shoulder point. So we're going to start with these horizontal lines. The elbow is set by the measurements we took earlier. So elbow to wrist, elbow to shoulder point. And then bicep is halfway between Forearm is halfway between on the lower half. Pretty simple. Most of the sleeve is pretty simple, actually. Then we're going to, all of the measurements that we're dealing with here are centered. We pretty much center the forearm measurement and draw the lines there, or draw the marks there, center the elbow measurement, draw the marks there. Same for the bicep, same for the wrist, and then connect the dots. Now here's the part where sleeves get a little tricky. I say that this is about 3 inches down where this starts. 3 inches is a standard. It's not even a standard. It's a starting place. It's a suggestion. 3 inches will get you a sleeve that will be okay. We're going to talk about whether that 3 inches is what you want or not in a second. But for now, we're going to pretend that 3 inches is what you want. And we're going to draw this 3 inches down, and we're going to connect all of these dots. And then when we get down to the bottom, we're probably going to have to add a little bit of an arc to this, just to make sure that we are keeping this at a nice 90-degree angle and this at a nice 90-degree angle. We have to join them together somehow. So you just kind of draw a little bridge, rainbow, arch, whatever you want to call it, shape down here to keep that smooth. You want to take any corners you may have and smooth those out so you end up with this weird tornado shape. And then we're going to fold it. And if you want to be lazy about your drawing and don't mind doing a little bit more math, I start with mine folded and only draw 1/2 of it and then just cut it out when I'm done. But a lot of people, I find, would rather draw both sides than do any more math. I don't tend to mind it, but I try to make my things as accessible to different learning styles as possible, and some people don't like numbers. We're now going to talk about sleeve caps. Sleeve caps get a little bit tricky, and they have a huge impact on the way your sleeves fit and the mobility of the garment you create. So again, if you want to just take the 3 inches and call that your decision, no judgment here. But if you want to understand how the intricacies of sleeve caps affect the thing you're making. Did I mention I'm a pattern nerd? I love this stuff. And I'm also super proud of figuring out how to explain this to people in a way that for most of the people I've taught this particular segment to find fairly accessible and understandable, which is great because it's weird stuff. One of the biggest things that can hamper your arm mobility is the height of your sleeve cap. So if you've ever worn a suit jacket, you very well know that all of these drag lines here are indicating where your suit jacket gets too tight if you try to lift your arm up. You've got a very tall sleeve cap in a suit jacket and a really shallow one in, say, a t-shirt. A t-shirt, you can stick your arm straight out and it's fine, no restriction at all. It looks okay. You're using up all that extra bulk that was under your arm is all going into that movement. But a suit jacket, you try to lift your arm up and it doesn't just make the sleeve tight, it makes the chest tight, it makes the back tight, and it just doesn't look good. It's also putting a lot of strain on that underarm. That tall sleeve cap definitely has some problems. But on the other hand, that tall sleeve cap looks super nice when your arms are straight down at your sides. There's no wrinkles, there's no extra bulk. And this t-shirt is just, it's baggy and it's got all this extra bulk right under your armpit. And it just kind of looks a little sloppy. It doesn't look very clean. How do you find the middle ground between the t-shirt and the suit jacket sleeve cap? This is the drawing I'm most proud of in this whole class. This is a super rough guideline to sort of predict how much mobility your sleeve is going to give you. If you map out the rough angle between where your underarm sits on your sleeve cap and the shoulder point part of your sleeve cap, if you were to draw a line between that and look at what that angle is, it pretty well corresponds to the part of your arm lift where you're gonna start feeling the restriction. So if one can go straight out, because that sleeve cap is just a straight line. If we are talking like 1920s evening wear, or not evening wear, 1920s like long sleeve day wear garments where ladies are not supposed to lift their arms up at all, your sleeve cap is going to be very high and very sharply angled. So you're not going to be able to lift past here without restriction. And then you've kind of got everything in between. So really the choice is up to you how much mobility you want to give, which is going to be contrasted to how much bulk is going to be both visibly and very tactily under your armpit. And only you can make the decision about how much seems right to you. The decision about what you want your sleeve cap to look like, you kind of just got to figure out for yourself, and you can adjust it in fitting later. You can look at it, but if you're going for something that is, you know, gorgeous court garb that you don't expect to have to set up your tent in, maybe you want this sharper, more angled sleeve cap, so it's going to be smooth and clean and pretty and not have unsightly drag lines in your armpit. On the other hand, if you're a fighter and you want something you can move in, maybe you want this much shallower sleeve cap up here. You got to make the choice. Sleeve, if you want to just be like, I don't know what I want, you can start with that 3 inches. It'll serve you okay. You can adjust it more later. You can modify it if you have to, but it is a good starting point. If you have much larger arms than the average person, you may want to go a little bit deeper than 3 inches, maybe 3.5, possibly even 4, but 3 inches is okay. It's not going to be bad. Now, how do we shape this sleeve cap? This sleeve cap is, so I apologize that this is sort of turned sideways. So this is the top center of the sleeve. This is the underarm point of the sleeve, and the sleeve cuff would be down here if we were seeing the whole thing. I had to try and figure out how to get it to fit on the slide. So I have sort of a color-coded key here. I stole this from my fighting garb class. The green line is what the back of the sleeve cap would look like if you are making fighting garb that really needs to be mobile. The pink line is the back of what a normal sleeve would look like. And the black is what the front of the sleeve cap would look like. So this is all like the sleeves folded in half like a butterfly around that center line that runs from shoulder point to wrist. I really like this sort of grid method for trying to figure out proportion. I find it really helps me visualize things a lot better. And it really is just, you draw a nice straight line that goes all the way from your underarm point to this fold line, nice perpendicular line here, and one that comes up from the highest point of the sleeve and goes that way. And then you'd put a line in between the two of them. And then you have your fold line here and the widest point here. And you put a line halfway in between those and a line halfway in between each of these. So it doesn't have to be a perfect square. It can be a tall, skinny rectangle. It can be a short, fat rectangle. It doesn't matter as long as each of these boxes is the same size as each of the other boxes. It's still going to give you your sleeve proportion. In general, you want your front sleeve cap line to intersect with this true center point. It's going to be pretty close. You want it to dip down into this B area. You want it to be fairly flat in the A area and fairly flat for most of the D area. And the rest of this is just smoothing it out in this very gentle S shape. Your typical back sleeve is going to be just a 1/4 of an inch, maybe 3/8 of an inch more filled in right in this B area, and pretty close to the same for most of the A, and pretty close to the same for most of the D. Only a little bit taller in the C, just very slightly different. And then if you're going with something where you need a ton of mobility, you're making fighting garb and you really need that reach forward, you can bump that back line up quite a bit here. Honestly, you could make it 3/4 of an inch difference instead of an inch, and that will make a big difference in how it fits, believe it or not. That the difference between 1/4 and 3/4 is huge when it comes to the back of your sleeve. And another thing here, if you really need that extra sleeve mobility, it can sometimes be helpful to make your sleeve cap measurement a little bit bigger than your arm's eye measurement. But again, you really want to ease that in. You don't want any tucks or gathers or pleats or anything in that. But this is sort of a guide to where your shaping on that sleeve cap needs to go. And again, you can squash this grid vertically, you can squash this grid horizontally, however that proportion ends up working. The only time that's going to really be different at all is if you were doing, say, if you were making like a late period poofy shirt and you needed a lot of gathering, you would basically lengthen just the C and D section if you were making a sleeve that had a really poofy gathered upper, because you don't want your underarm to have gathers. That would be super uncomfortable. So that would change the proportion if you were doing something like that. But for a Cotehardie, this is a good guideline for how to shape your sleeve cap. You want this to be your center point, and you want this to be flat, and this to basically come out at a 90-degree angle and stay fairly flat for a little bit. There's one other way to work on balancing your sleeve to make sure that it's going to sew a nice garment, and that's unfolding that little butterfly fold that's down the center, and then folding each side in on what would be the 1/4 line all the way down. And if you fold that in, your top and your bottom should line up nicely with a nice smooth transition, no point and no valley, top and bottom. And you should be able to fold that and get those pieces to line up. If you fold them on that 1/4 line and you end up with it wanting to sit like this or put bubbles in it, your sleeve is not balanced. And it's always going to slightly rotate around your arm. It's always going to slightly torque if it's not balanced. So you really want to make sure that when you fold your sleeve together like this, that this entire line sits together smoothly with these being able to be folded. And that also gives you a chance to make sure that this is a nice smooth transition at your underarm and a nice smooth transition at your cuff. That's all I have to chatter at you about for today, which I know is already a lot. But with all of that, you should be able to use your measurements to draft a pattern that looks similar to what I have put up on the in the earlier slide. For tomorrow, there's homework, everyone's favorite. Next time, we are going to go over fitting and how to true your pattern from fitting. Yes, that does put the sleeve seam under the arm, and we can modify that later. So if you are following along with this and we want to get into fitting for tomorrow, you're going to need a mock-up. And again, I highly recommend making your mock-up out of something stable but cheap. Muslin is more expensive, in my opinion, than old used bed sheets that you don't love anymore. but like whatever you have laying around, it's fine if it's ridiculous. You're going to be cutting apart bits of it and safety pinning it and drawing on it with a Sharpie to try and make it look better. Also, save yourself some work. Only make one sleeve. You got two arms, unless they're dramatically different, you don't need to fit two sleeves. And sometimes it's nice to be able to look at the shape your arm's eye is. So you're going to make some really stylish mock-ups. It's a thing. But you're going to need a buddy to help you with fitting if you're following along next time. Some small snips if we need to make modifications, some safety pins, any accessories you're working around. If you have a bra you must wear, or if you have a hood that you want the neckline to sit nicely under, whatever it is that you need to go with this, you want to have that on hand. And then we are going to need a lot of the pattern drafting supplies that we talked about for today, because we are going to be fitting your patterns and truing your pattern, fitting your mock-ups and truing your patterns. So at the end of tomorrow's class, you should come away with a fully functional Cotehardie pattern. And don't worry about what length you want your Cotehardie to be. We are going to make that pattern stop at the high hip regardless, because it's a lot more fabric efficient, and beyond that, it's just a straight line. So we're going to take some measurements on how far it needs to go to reach wherever you want it to go on your body. We are only doing high hip up as a torso mock-up and pattern. The rest of it can be highly variable depending on your fabric width and how you want to do that. So that's all I have for today. All right.
Well, thank you, and we'll let you go cuddle your puppy.
All righty.
Thank you
all
again
for coming, and I will see all of you later.
Wonderful.
Tomorrow, in fact.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Thank you all so much. Have a good night.
Thank
you. You too.